But hey, I think we're live, so try and behave yourselves. I'll try to behave myself for sure.
We could have stayed home.
You could have stayed home and seen this, but I didn't want to tell you till you got here. I did have several folks that they couldn't make it, and I said, okay, well, I'll let you in on a little secret. If this works, I'll tell everybody about it. But I wanted to make sure it worked first before I did that. Besides, you get your questions answered if you're here. I'm not gonna be streaming your questions tonight. So if you have questions, that's tough. I'm not gonna answer those questions. So. Yeah, as I said, I've been doing this a lecture kind of like this for about 20 years. Genesis is the beginning. I love Genesis. I said when I preached on it, I could spend all semester in it. So I thought, hey, why not spend all fall in the book of Genesis and look at that? It's a book that has caused division. Any Old Testament professor, if he wants to get fired, all he needs to do is teach on Genesis, and that'll do it. I had a colleague, one mentor that got me into this whole thing, actually the person whom Daniel is named after. When I took Old Testament from him, he was teaching a very small conservative Baptist school in Mississippi. He said, Genesis 1 through 11 is known as the primeval history. Now, Genesis 12. And that was it. That's all I got on this material. Because he didn't want to talk about it. It was going to be too dangerous. So I thought we'd look at the first few verses here. Everybody got this? We all good? Good. Great. So, Bareoshit bara Elohim et hashemayim va'et haaretz. One of the things, I know you're not going to be able to translate it, but one of the things I think is interesting to note in these first couple of verses is there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words that make up that very first verse. And when you get to the second verse, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 words that make up the second verse. So 7 words in the first, 14 in the second. There are 35 mentions of God. There are 21 mentions of the earth, 21 mentions of the heaven and the firmament. 7 times God says, and it was good. 7 times it says, and it was so. And of course, 7 days of creation. Do you notice any themes in any of those things? Some of you math-inclined people might notice. Yeah, 7's a fairly prominent number in Genesis chapter 1. It is a recurring theme that we'll get, and actually, for some folks, that is a universal sort of number. In fact, the suggestion, I remember this, if you were paying attention last Sunday, I was talking about the Sarah Ephraimite woman. When I talked about the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 basketfuls left over. Many interpreters read that as a sign of universality, that there's enough bread left over for the rest of the world, not just the 12 basketfuls when the Jewish feeding, there's 7 with the Gentile feeding. So that's probably not an accident on that. But how to translate that first verse is tough. If you just sort of went directly, most traditional translations go with Bareoshit, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens here is a dual form. Hebrew has singular and plural and dual. If you have 2. So hands are always in the dual, eyes, ears. It's a really handy kind of plural. Heavens is in a dual. That's because there's basically 3 heavens. There's the heavens where the birds fly, there's the heavens where the planets are, and then there's where God lives. And so I think what Genesis 1 is saying is God's not doing any home remodeling with this. All right, he's working on creation here. He's making a separate place. But the other way to translate that is as a temporal phrase. And so what you see in Bible translations, you will get in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but you will also get when God began to create the heavens and the earth, and in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. All of those are grammatically appropriate. And there is really no way to know how to prioritize one over another. And so that sort of, by the way, if you have questions, just wave or something, and I'm happy to stop. But that sort of makes you ask the question, it makes me ask the question, does the beginning of Genesis teach creatio ex nihilo? This is a translation that you know in RSV. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. I don't like that translation. We're going to talk about that in a second. I like formless and void, or without shape and empty, something like that. It's 2 words in Hebrew. It's tohu and bohu, which I just like saying out loud, tohu and bohu. Tohu v'bohu, formless and empty, shapeless and the earth was a formless void, darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Wind from God, mighty wind, breath of God blew. All of those are legitimate translations of that. I like God swept over the face of the waters. Hovered is sometimes the translation. It's the modern Hebrew word for hang gliding. I don't think that helps us a whole lot, but it's a nice picture of the Spirit of God hang gliding over the face of the waters. You have Yahweh into extreme sports. You don't get that in many translations. But anyway, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day. The darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was... Starts at 6 o'clock, in case anyone's curious. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So what we see in this this first day is this system that starts, this form that starts. We get a repeated structure. But the question I asked a second ago, does Genesis 1 teach creatio ex nihilo? Some would say, no, it does not, because there are waters there. Right? Creatio ex nihilo means what? Anyone know their Latin?
Creation from nothing.
Creation from nothing. We've got some Latin skiles here. Does it teach creation from nothing? Some say no, because the waters are there. Some say, well, where did the waters come from? And so they say the idea of creatio ex nihilo really developed, the creation from nothing really developed later on theologically. It really became a popular interpretation in between the Testament periods, between the Old and New Testament. But some say, yes, it does teach creation from nothing because it says God created. And the Hebrew word, bara, he created, is only ever used with God as the subject. That's it. God is the only one who can bara. God will also make asa. That happens a lot in chapter 1. But human beings can do this. You and I can asa. We can make things. You know, my father-in-law could make a pile of wood into a bookshelf. He was amazing. But that maybe bara, maybe create, implies something that only God can do. And maybe that's creation from nothing. It's a possible interpretation of that. My answer is, does Genesis 1 teach creation from nothing? I don't know. Maybe. I got sometimes yes, I got sometimes no. That's not a hill I'm willing to die on at the end of the day. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I theologically think it's important, but I'm not sure if Genesis teaches it. But the 6 days with the symmetrical structure I talked about, and God said, let there be whatever. And there was whatever. And God saw that whatever it was good, and that there was evening and the morning, day, whatever. I was always troubled by evening and morning why does evening come before morning on that? And it's because in the Jewish mind, the day begins at sundown. And so Sabbath starts Friday night at sundown and ends Saturday night at sundown. So that's why evening comes first. This 6-day structure is repeated. There's a little bit of modification a couple of places. Day 2 is never said to be good, but that's okay because we've got 2 goods on day 3, and that way we still have 7. We don't want that to screw up our system, right? So if we're going to add an extra good, you got to take it from someplace else. And unfortunately, day 2 lost it was good in that. But we have this 6-day symmetrical structure. The Sabbath is the only day that doesn't follow that. In fact, the Sabbath is the only day that doesn't have an evening and a morning. And so that's led some interpreters to wonder if the Sabbath day is a day we're currently living in, because it's never said to begin or end. In other words, we have 6 days of God creating, and now God is resting from the kind of creating he was doing on those first 6 days, and now interacting with his creation as he comes. So, it's possible. I don't know. Maybe. All of this is designed to show just how powerful God is. All of this is designed to show how God is able to just speak it and it happens. And of course, you should know your structures. Day 1, we get light. Day 2, we get the heavens and the waters defined. Day 3, the land appears. Day 4, the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, the air animals and the water animals. Day 6, the land animals. And finally, God created the weekend, because everybody's working for the weekend. Even God comes to work for the weekend here. So, as I say, it's a poetic expression of God's transcendence. Now, I say poetic expression. It's not, strictly speaking, poetry. We may need more chairs. Isn't that exciting? Actually, we do need more chairs. Where are the chairs? He asked, hopefully. Okay.
We're fine. We're good.
You got it? Okay.
Okay.
Now we can tell folks to bring your own chairs. That's what's going to happen. It is a poetic expression of God's transcendence. The emphasis in Genesis chapter 1 is that God does not get God's hands dirty, ever. God speaks it, and it happens, just as any good king would. Right? When the Queen of England wants a rose garden on the side of the castle, she doesn't go and buy a hoe. She says, we want a rose garden on the side of the castle, and you get a rose garden on the side of the castle. I mean, that's the picture you have of God in Genesis 1, a picture of king of all creation. that is happening. So it's a very royal image, very transcendent image, very above all and overall kind of image. How are we doing so far?
Okay.
Good?
Great.
Good? No questions? No problems? I get wound up, I know. So, yes, ma'am.
Who is doing this structure?
Who is doing this? Is a
Individual
Oh.
corporate?
Yeah.
Is made-
Okay, well, I would say I would encourage you to come to the men's retreat, but I probably shouldn't do that, should I? That wouldn't be appropriate. Probably the best way for me to say this is that texts are constructed by communities. We have, I think, kind of have a romantic idea about how books are made. I think we have this idea of, J.K. Rowling sitting in a coffee shop banging out Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone on her computer, and off it goes to the publisher, and we wonder if we have Harry Potter. But with even like the book I'm working on, I have a main editor that I've been working with. I send a rough draft to him. He sends his comments back. I then, after we get satisfied, it'll go to 3 other copy editors. Eventually, you get the marketing and the layout editors. And by the time my book comes out, it will just have my name on it. But there are going to be anywhere from 15 to 50 people who've contributed substantively. So even today, texts are created by communities, right?
So that's where JEDP.
That's where the whole. If you ever know the alphabet soup of JEDP, yeah. What Julius Wellhausen. I didn't expect to bring that name up this evening, but when you have advanced students, obviously you need to be prepared for that kind of thing. Julius Wellhausen was the German scholar who believed that he saw the individual sources, the J for Yahwist, E for Elohist, D for Deuteronomist, P for priestly authors that had been woven together. I think that's somewhat oversimplistic. No one holds to that theory of authorship today, but it is absolutely what we have here is a composite text produced by the Israelite community. That's what I'm going to say. I guess the simplest way for me to answer that is I believe God inspired the text. So God can use whoever God wants to use at that point to put the pen on the paper. But yeah, and I believe it was a community shaped as it came through. So yeah, good question.
Over an extended period, I assume.
Probably, yeah, probably, and products of their own culture, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. That helps us, I think, understand it. But yeah, probably over time that this comes together. I said it's a poetic expression. Genesis 1's not poetry. Strictly speaking, it's not poetry. It doesn't have the markings of Hebrew poetry, which you ever get that sense where the Bible repeats itself all the time? It'll say one line and say the same thing again. That's a feature of Hebrew poetry, is the parallelisms, and. Genesis 1 is not that, but it thoroughly is poetic. It's very structured, as I said to begin with, right? 7 words in the first verse, 14 words in the second, 35 mentions of God, 21 mentions of earth, 21 mentions of heavens and firmament. There's a lot of structure that you get here. And there's even more structure around those 2 words that I mentioned, tohu and bohu, formless and void. Because if you look at the way the days are laid out, the first day you get light, the 4th day you get the sun, moon, and stars. The 2nd day you get the heavens and the waters. The 5th day you get the air animals and the water animals. The 3rd day you get the land and the vegetation. The 6th day you get the land animals, including human beings. So that the book is actually, the chapter is actually poetically arranged even around those words formless and empty. So the first 3 days are focused on giving creation form and building the containers. And the last 3 days are focused on putting things in the containers. So pretty easy to see with air and birds and ocean and sea creatures and land and people. But students always ask, what does a light container look like without putting light in it? And I said, well, that should give us a clue that we're looking at something different, that this is a little different than a scientific treatise here. This is a poetic expression about who God is, ultimately. And I think that's an important point we're going to talk about next week as well. The mistake people make when they interpret Genesis 1 and 2 is they think these texts are about creation. These texts are not about creation. These texts, and I would argue the entire Bible, is about God. And the text is using creation to talk about who God is. But ultimately, this text is talking about God. And I think that's an important, end game to keep in mind. What is this saying about God? So, royal, transcendent, above all, overall, etc. So, make sense? We're good? All right. Questions? Comments? Diatribe? Concern? Violent opposition? No, we're okay. Good. Well, let's go on then. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. This one is offset in poetry, you might notice. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So in Genesis 1, humankind, male and female, created at the same time, both bearing God's image, neither one more in the image of God than the other. One might even argue that it takes both to make up the image of God, that they would sort of be incomplete, one or the other, in that context. And God blessed them, and God said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." So everybody's a vegetarian. And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good, tov mod in Hebrew, and there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Not perfect is not the sense of this, but if you could understand, this is exactly what I was going for. That's the sense of very good. That's what I wanted. That's it. I also think that there is probably, and this is one of those things that if I was a Genesis scholar and I could spend more time in, I'd probably want to dig deeper into. I think there is a strong association of good and ordered. I think good and ordered are probably synonyms, and I think evil and chaos are probably synonyms in the mind of ancient Israel. And I think that's important as you get into a little bit later into the story. But I think that's probably right. So, now I know as you looked at those verses, some questions probably came to your mind. Let me get the most popular ones out of the way, and then we'll get to the other ones. If you have a question about the dinosaurs, I wasn't planning on answering that one, so you can hold on to that one. My answer is early in day 6. That's my answer on that. So, all right. What are your questions? First of all, why is God plural? That's a pretty common one. Let us make humankind in our image and our likeness. Various answers over the years have been given for that. Of course, the first answer, the very popular one throughout Christian history, was the question of Trinity, right? That God's plural and there's a plural, so there you go. Let me take a moment. That's me, isn't it? That's Thomas. I'm not going to be hit by the hurricane, Thomas. Meg wants to be on the Facebook Live?
No, I looked at it and everything's backwards.
Well, that's not good.
So we're going to fix it.
Oh, okay. So everybody will need to hold their videos up to a mirror when they're watching the Facebook Live. So,
Until we changed it around.
Until we change it around, then we're in good shape. Okay. Why is God plural? Let me take a moment and say, big fan of the Trinity, believe in the Trinity. It's really important in my theology. Don't think Genesis is talking about Trinity here. I'm sort of an Occam's razor kind of guy. So I'm not, let's set aside Trinity for just a second. Some suggest it's plural. Yes, sir?
Occam's razor, is that the one where the simplest?
The simplest is usually the best one, yes. And the second interpretation is he's talking to the royal court, that God is speaking to royal court here. There's angels, and that's who this conversation is being directed to. Maybe. I mean, we haven't gotten in the story yet, so I don't necessarily go that way. For me, the most compelling argument for God's plural pronoun in Genesis chapter 1 is that this is the royal we that we have here. This is a very royal picture that you have of God. God is set up as king of all creation, and that this royal we is, as any good monarch would speak with, let us make humankind in our image. And so for me, that's the simplest explanation. It fits the context of Genesis 1, so I don't run crazy with that too far. So that's the where I answer that. What is meant by God's image? This one's been talked about a lot as well. There are some who suggest it is our capacity to love. I don't necessarily go with that one because I've known better dogs than people, and so I don't think that's necessarily the one that defines us. Some say our capacity to reason. Then I watched some chimpanzees beat senior math scores last year in a scientific test, so I'm worried about that now as well, and the future of humanity. But the image is distinctive in Genesis 1. It is something that sets humanity apart in some way. And what I think is important to remember is that in the rest of the ancient Near East, to bear God's image was usually a royal statement. It were the kings that bore the God's image, or if you're in the case of Egypt, you were in fact God incarnate. But throughout the rest of the world, the belief was that, that kings bore God's image. To say that all of humanity bears the image of God is a huge countercultural statement. It is really a bold statement the Bible is making here that's really democratizing that image of God. Everybody bears God's image. Both male and female, the whole world bears God's image. And that is significant. And part of bearing God's image comes with it a royal stewardship, right? Humanity gets dominion. This is a word that's been misused a lot. The word dominion is not a word that should convey, it shouldn't convey kingship the way we think of kingship. In the biblical text, a good king is a king who used the kingship for Torah, who used the kingship for the least of these, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. The good king is the one who is using the kingship for God. The bad king is the one who uses the kingship for self, right? The one who uses his position and power to get what he wants or expand his territory or expand his attitude and vision. So the notion of dominion in the biblical text, good dominion, is that dominion that is a faithful steward of this thing for God back. In other words, to love creation the way God has loved humanity. That's what is meant, I think, by dominion in Genesis 1. That's a Genesis 1 vision. Yeah.
In the New Testament, we go through this drill where the modern English comes from the Latin, which came from the Greek, which came possibly from the Semitic, or originally written in Greek.
Right.
Do we do that drill with this, or is this straight from the Hebrew?
This is no, Hebrew doesn't have the sense of Latin, but it does have that sense of, this is one of the times language, right? Stewardship might be the good way to go there. I think steward would be a much better translation because it would at least remind humanity that they both have a boss and a responsibility.
I guess what we have the original.
Dominion doing. Right, we do. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a little bit, but English translations, they take on a force of their own. Right? Once tradition, once the King James has done it, right? It's hard to work against those translations as they come down over time. So that's one of them. So those are the three most popular questions I get on that creation of humanity bit. What are the questions that you have on that, real quick, before we move on? I'm just so thorough. There's just no questions to ask. Is what it is. I've covered everything. So, all right. Well, let's keep looking. Let me talk about this. This is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is a Babylonian creation epic, and it was written in cuneiform, and it predates the biblical text. And when I say it predates the biblical text, I mean it significantly predates the biblical text by at least a millennia, probably 2 millennia. This story is a very, very old story. Enuma Elish the title itself comes from the first 2 words, just like traditionally most ancient texts were named, when on high. And by the way, this structure grammatically, when on high, is exactly the same sort of grammatical structure you get at the beginning of Genesis. When I said before, the translation could be when God began to create. That's probably the better one, or more in keeping with the ancient sense of what's going on in that text. That it's not trying to make a moment of demarcation, but it's just talking about the nature of creation. So that's one parallel you get here. This is a little tiny cylinder seal, an ancient cylinder seal that depicts the story of the Enuma Elish. Let me give you sort of the rough story of the Enuma Elish in general. It goes kind of like this. There is the evil, watery sea dragon named Tiamat. She is a saltwater dragon. She is the old guard dragon. And you have to understand, in the ancient world, with the exception of the Phoenicians, and I still don't know why the Phoenicians are different, but in the ancient world, everyone is terrified of the ocean. Everyone is terrified of the ocean. Nobody wants to go out in the ocean. Ocean's going to get you killed. It's terrifying. Ocean is always representing chaos and primordial, disaster, and it's going to kill you every time. For some reason, the Phoenicians love to sail. They didn't mind the ocean at all. Everyone else is terrified, except the Phoenicians. Tiamat is the embodiment, I would say personification, but she's a dragon. So the dragonification, I don't know. I need a word for that. But she is the incarnation, if you will. Does that work? Yeah, probably. Of the dangerous, chaotic sea that you have there. Tiamat is the dragon. Marduk is the strapping young god of Babylon. So if I tell you this is a Babylonian creation story, you probably got a pretty good idea who's going to be the hero of this when we get to the end of it. But it basically went like this. Tiamat and the old gods wanted to be served by the young gods. and the young gods don't like being pushed around. And so this eventually comes to a head, and finally Marduk, the god of Babylon, challenges Tiamat to a battle. And so I've got some selections of this here. Forgive me for the blurriness. And I actually have some copies if you'd like your own copy of the Enuma Elish. I bet we are the only church in Fairfax County who are reading Babylonian creation text this evening. Could I just take a moment to make this a distinctive for McLean Baptist Church? But they go to battle one another, and advance Tiamat and Marduk, the counselor of the gods, to the fight they came on, to the battle they drew nigh. The Lord, that would be Marduk, spread out his net and caught her, and an evil wind that was behind him he let loose in her face. So just to catch you up here, he has now caused this wind to blow over her waters, if you will, which is somewhat familiar. As Tiamat opened her mouth to its full extent, he drove in the evil wind, while as yet she had not shut her lips. So she's going to swallow him, and he caused the wind to blow in her face so hard that now she can't close her mouth. It's blowing her mouth open. The terrible winds have filled her belly, so now she is blown up like a balloon. And her courage was taken from her. Well, I would imagine that would do it, right? When someone has blown you up, that's the end of that story. He seized a spear and burst her belly, so he pops her now that she has blown up like a balloon. He severed her inward parts, pierced her heart, overcame her, and cut off her life. So now Marduk has won. Well, now that he has won, this is what he does with her. He split her up like a flat fish in two halves. One half of her he established as a covering for heaven. He fixed a bolt and stationed a watchman and bade them to not let her waters come forth. In other words, he separated the waters from the waters to keep the waters above from coming down to the waters below. That might sound a little familiar if in that description there. We continue on. The stars, their images as the stars of the zodiac he fixed. He ordained the year into sections. He divided it. For 12 months he fixed 3 stars. In the midst thereof he fixed the zenith. The moon god he caused to shine forth. The night he entrusted to him. He appointed him a being of the night to determine the days. So we have the celestial beings now that have been created as part of this as well, leaving only humankind. When Marduk heard the god's speech, he conceived a desire to accomplish clever things. Well, who doesn't? He opened his mouth, addressing Ea. He counsels that which he had pondered in his heart. I will bring together blood and form bone. I will bring into being a savage, whose name shall be man. I will create a savage, man, or humanity, on whom the toil of the gods will be laid, that they may rest. So in other words, he realized the problem hasn't been solved. Tiamat wanted the young gods to serve him, but now that he's in charge, he wants people to serve him too. So he's decided that he's going to create savages named human beings who are going to serve them. And that way, after all of this creation, the gods can finally be at rest. So resting at the end of creation is what they're aiming for here. Which also sounds a little familiar. We'll hold on to that too. Kingu was Tiamat's boyfriend. I don't think they'd gotten married because Tiamat's first husband had died. He was freshwater. They killed the freshwater god, and that's one of the things that made her so angry. And so now I think she's dating Kingu. I don't know the full story there, but I'm sure it was on TMZ. They probably covered it. Anyway, who made Tiamat rebel and set the battle in motion. They bound him, holding him before Ea. They inflicted the penalty on him, severed his blood vessels. From his blood, he, Ea, created humankind, on whom he imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. So, in all of this now, humanity is created out of the blood of the gods, but created for the service of the gods. That's the purpose here. Humanity are the slaves that are to do what the gods want them to do. And then finally, and I think this is fascinating, let a man rejoice in Marduk, the Lord of the gods, that he may cause his land to be fruitful and that he himself may have prosperity. So that the goal of this at the end of the day, make sure you are delighting in Marduk. Make sure you are delighting in the gods. And if you do, if you take care and do your stuff right in the temple, then Marduk will cause your land to be fruitful. Right? If you're obedient, then you can have nice things. But if you're not obedient, well, then sorry, it's not going to work. Now, as I go through that, I obviously was overly highlighting them, but there are a number of echoes that you see, right? And this is a really important point for me, because when I interpret the biblical text, I read the biblical text as occasional literature. And by that I mean the Bible was written to address specific occasions. There is no point in the Bible where anyone said, you know what, I've got this great idea for a creation story. Stay with me. Nobody has that. It doesn't come out of nowhere, right? The Bible is written for something. And it's easy to remember that in the New Testament, right? When you see Paul writing a letter to the Corinthians, it's easy to remember that there are things going on in Corinth that made Paul write the letter to the Corinthians. That's pretty easy. And it might even be easy to remember when we're looking at the Gospels, right? John is facing something at the end of the first century, or Matthew and Mark and Luke are dealing with that first generation dying off, and Mark and Luke are trying to remember how the Gentiles fit into this whole gospel story. So it's easy even then, I think, to remember some of the occasion. In the Old Testament, I think sometimes we forget that. We sometimes forget that these are as much written to deal with specific circumstances as the rest of the texts are. And so this is where I want to say the rest of the world of ancient Near East that we're talking about had some form of belief in that creation story I just told you. Their local gods would get substituted in, but they all had that same formula. It was always the saltwater god that was evil, that was always doing battle with the hero god, and that hero god always broke up that saltwater god and did it how they felt they needed to do it. Everyone had that. In the case of the Syrians, in the case of Aram, they had a god. The saltwater god was connected to Lotan. Lotan, boy, that is a serious concern. It would not let go, would it? Lotan, if you spell Lotan in Ugaritic, and then you spell Lotan in Hebrew, it looks exactly like the phrase Leviathan. Okay, so when you look in the Old Testament at the word Leviathan, you've heard Leviathan, that is not a crocodile, that's not a dinosaur, it's not a dragon. The Leviathan is invoking that memory of the chaos dragon, right? It's invoking that memory of this creation narrative, this destructive, violent creation narrative. So Genesis 1 is entering into a world where everyone else subscribes to what I just told you about with Tiamat, the creation story you have right there. And Genesis 1 comes in, and for me, I mean, some people get twitchy about the similarities. I think what we really need to focus on are the differences. I mean, the differences between what Genesis, basically, in my mind, Genesis 1 through 11, and really a lot of places in the Bible, but Genesis 1 through 11 in particular, are the Old Testament version of, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. Genesis 1 through 11 are, you've heard this said about creation, but I say unto you. You've heard this said about the flood, but I say. You've heard this said about the tower, but I say this unto you. I mean, this is the Bible offering and I would even call it prophetic corrective into the rest of the world, speaking a very powerful and, quite frankly, dangerous truth back to the world. So these are just some of the differences you see. First of all, creation is good in Genesis 1. This is really important. Creation is good. It is exactly what God was going for. You know, when you think about life in this world, and I'm looking at this crowd, and I probably don't have to tell some of you, life in this world can be miserable beyond measure sometimes. There is unfairness, there is suffering, there is sickness, there is hardship, there is difficulty as we live in this world. And if you subscribe to the creation narrative of the Enuma Elish, that's not hard to understand why, right? I mean, if the whole world is made, and when you start with an evil, watery chaos dragon, how good is life going to be, right? I mean, Papa Wallace always said, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, right? So you're not going to, this is as good as you're going to get when you start with the evil, watery chaos dragon. The Bible comes along and says, no. Creation is good. Creation is exactly what God was going for. Creation is not some trophy to show off. Creation is not the product of some, effort to get out of work. Creation in Genesis 1 is better than uncreation. God of all the universe decided that there was a desire for heaven to touch earth, and in that we see this beautiful picture of goodness in creation. So that's not why life is hard. Spoiler alert, we find out why life is hard in Genesis 3, but that's a couple of weeks from now, so we're going to hold off on that. Life is hard, right? Life is good right now. Everything's good. Humanity, all of humanity, as I pointed out, created in the divine image. Not just men, not just kings, all of humanity created in the divine image. All of it bearing that reflection of the divine and pointing to the divine. I love the way that N.T. Wright puts it as an angled mirror, that to bear the image of God is to be that angled mirror that reflects God to the world and reflects the world back to God, that stewardship goes in that way. And so that's that sense of this beautiful picture of divine image. Humanity, all of humanity, has a royal kingly responsibility with creation. We are to steward creation. This is the really cool thing about Genesis 1. Creation is not done in Genesis 1. God creates a creation that continues to create. Seed after its kind, be fruitful and multiply. Creation is not done. It is to create a world that can continue to create itself in this. Humanity is going to steward that creation with God. It's a beautiful co-creative picture that you get in Genesis 1. Not you people are servants, and if you do nice things, you get nice things. No. God is actually gracious. God says, be fruitful and multiply. That's at the beginning. That's the first speech God gives to humanity. Go be fruitful and multiply. Look at the Enuma Elish. If you do what Marduk says, maybe he can give you some nice things, right? I mean, that's what you get in the Enuma Elish. You have to actually make Marduk happy, and then you get blessing. Not Genesis 1. No. Genesis 1 opens with, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Actually offering a blessing of grace, offering a blessing of fruitfulness. Something's disappeared. What happened?
Phone's ringing.
The phone rang. Well, it's probably someone telling me I need to vote in my local election. So, you know what I need to do? I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi off so people will stop doing that. Okay, where was I?
Be fruitful and multiply.
That be fruitful and multiply, right? Because God is gracious. Glad I held the notes together. It is that promise, that sense that we actually have a responsibility to fill the earth. And now I can't get to Sue Ellen's drive anymore. This is, like I said, this is the first run through. Before we do this, next week we'll remember these things and then we'll advertise it. And you guys get to be the beta testers this week, so this is good. Most of the ancient Near Eastern stories are, what are we going to do when these people get out of hand? Right? They're too noisy. They're taking up all the land. We're going to see this later on in the flood, but I'll spoiler alert a little bit now. God says after the flood to Noah, go be fruitful and multiply. All the other ancient Near Eastern gods after the flood said, we'll never flood the earth again. We'll use animal attacks, famine, and plagues now to control the population. Thank you? Right? Really? No. God's concern is that we fill the earth, subdue it, go and be fruitful, multiply. So it's this wonderfully positive, celebratory kind of picture you get here in Genesis 1. So one of the things you probably noticed is that you didn't hear me talk a whole lot about evolution, creationism, that kind of thing. And the reason for that is I don't think it's really what the text is talking about. That's a question that we bring to it. And for me, when I'm reading the biblical text, I'm much more interested in listening to what questions the Bible is trying to answer. Right? What does it say? I want to know, probably this is the better way to hear it. I want to know what's going on in Corinth so I can hear what Paul is saying to Corinth so I can better understand what God is saying to me. That is the way I read the Old Testament as well. I want to know what this text was saying to those people who received it so I can better hear what God is saying to me. A good God of all creation, who thinks creation is better than uncreation, who sees all of humanity in the divine image, that bears that royal responsibility. That to me is a beautiful picture. Genesis creation is talked about a lot of different ways in Genesis. It's in the Bible. You've got this order in Genesis 1. We're going to see next week a different order in Genesis 2. You see a different order in Psalm 74. You see a different order in Psalm 104. You see a slightly different order in Psalm 8 and other creation themes like Psalm 19. The Bible didn't care a whole lot about making sure everything fell in a particular way. The Bible was very interested in what it was saying about God. But you might be interested to know that although you hear the echoes in Genesis 1 of the Enuma Elish, probably the louder echo of the Enuma Elish is in Psalm 74. Psalm 74 has a brief creation spot in the middle of it. It's actually a lament, a communal lament over the destruction of the temple. And the temple's been destroyed, and exile has started, and we're being taken off into Babylon, and we don't know what we're going to do. But in the middle of Psalm 74, there's this moment celebrating God as king, and him crushing the heads of the dragons, and causing the streams to fall, and Leviathan to die, and giving things for food to his people. And so you have this little celebration of creation that it's probably the one place in the Old Testament creation is really violent. You don't get that kind of violence. You see that? Did you find it there?
It was you who split open the sea by your power.
Yes.
You broke the heads of the monster in the waters.
Yes, you smushed the heads of dragons. Some translations, well, not smushed, crushed the heads of dragons there. So it's a very violent act there. But I think you still hear those echoes. Everyone knew this is how you tell a creation story, right? You can't start a fairy tale without once upon a time. And you can't tell a creation story in the ancient Near East about how you're going to handle the chaos waters in this story. You couldn't do something brand new. You have to work within what everyone's expecting. You can play with it a little bit, and say, but there has to be enough that people realize this is what you're talking about. Just like any good story goes, you can deal against a type once you've established a type, but you have to establish that type. You have to work within a genre, right? There's certain things a horror movie does. Certain movie romantic comedy does. There's certain things, and you know what you're watching. You know what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. I always say, if you know you're going to a romantic comedy, you're pretty sure at no point in that movie is an infected monkey going to escape and try to threaten the population of the earth with disease. That's not your major theme of a romantic comedy, usually, right? You actually have the guy, the girl, the misunderstanding, You ever notice when they're going shopping in a romantic comedy, they always order paper and never plastic? And whenever they get bread, it's always a baguette that's sticking out the top of the bag. Nobody has Wonder Bread in a romantic comedy. I don't know why that is,
Because it's so romantic.
Exactly. But that's the point. There are certain kind of forms you see. Well, Genesis 1's the same way, right? You have the waters, the splitting, how do creation connect? How do these things happen? So that's the connections we get here. So we've got about 5 or 10 more minutes. So you guys, I know at this I've given you a sip of water through a fire hose and I talk fast and you've got questions now. What did you want to ask? What did you want to talk about? Yes, sir.
Just briefly, I was struck by the analogy of ocean as chaos.
Yeah.
You've seen that book, Noah's Ark, by the archaeologists who have looked at the sudden flooding of the Black Sea basin.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their ideas is that waters that appear suddenly are a bad thing.
Yes.
And that the water, and of course, the flood story is one of these commonalities.
We're probably going to see that this weekend, that waters appear suddenly are a bad thing in a lot of places in this country. Yeah. I mean, that is a common, again, except the Phoenicians. They loved the sea. And so most people just let them go ahead and do it then. You go ahead and do that. But most of them did not enjoy that waters will get you killed. The ocean will get you killed, even in the New Testament. When you see Jesus walking upon the water, or you see Jesus calming the storm, that is not just a matter of calming the disciples. That is an important statement about the nature of God. My colleague likes to say that the New Testament doesn't have a lot of declarative statements of Godhead for Jesus. They're functional statements of Godhead for Jesus. In other words, Jesus never takes a moment and says, hey, everybody, just so you know, I'm God. Just want to make that clear. But what Jesus does is he calms the chaos in this. He makes bread in the wilderness. These things that God does, that's what Jesus does. So, it's a functional claim to deity. That's what's going on in the New Testament as well, this calming of the sea. Seas are still terrifying in the New Testament. People are scared of water. Yeah, absolutely. What other thoughts you got?
Concerning this and future things you're going
Sure.
to say, are they all pretty much believed by all of your colleagues? Are there shades of, are there nuances that other people would say that disagree with you?
I'm sure there's plenty of people who disagree with me. Someone asked me that this week. Was my reading of the Syrophoenician woman a mainline reading of it? And I said, well, it is among the scholars I trust. And that's probably the best way to say that. The people, and there are even some very good, and I would put on the more conservative readings of the Old Testament, someone like John Walton, who did a great deal of work on the lost world of Genesis 1 or the lost world of Adam and Eve. He's a very conservative individual, and he's going to give you the same stuff I gave you here for the most part. Yeah. Now, you will see a lot of people want to push more, trying to make this resonate with scientific ideas, and that's not my wheelhouse at all, because I don't think
I'm
that's
speaking
what
more
Texas
of your colleagues rather than...
Oh, sure, they would be 100% on. Yeah, absolutely. My colleagues are using my videos that are on YouTube that say this very stuff to teach the Old Testament class that I left them with when I took this church. So they agree with me enough to let me say it for them, actually. So yeah,
But
absolutely.
can we put a date on this?
Can we put a date on this? I can give you a late date on this. I would say that the latest that we understand this text to come would be probably the 6th century BC. That would be the latest I would give you. The entire Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, the late date for that, I would say, is in place by 400 BC, somewhere there. The
Do you
prophets.
agree that this first creation story in chapter 1 was written after the second creation story that comes
Probably.
right after it?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah. I mean, as far as the date is concerned. maybe.
At the risk of stealing some of your.
No, that's, no.
Next week, why do you think there's two creation stories?
Well, that
We
would
just wait
steal.
till next week.
That would steal next week's.
Okay,
that,
I
so-
can wait.
Yeah.
So basically you distilled the entire creation story, first creation story into 4 messages from God.
Which are,
Well, I mean, the 4, you know,
The- this-
creation is good.
right.
And all that is, and we're created in,
Mm-hmm.
and we have responsibility.
Yeah,
and
I think
that's
there's more,
crazy.
but yeah, I think these are really, for me, these are the big ones. When you look at what is the Bible saying that is speaking a prophetic word to the world it's living in, right? And that is that, first of all, the world is not bad. The world is not evil. Creation is not evil. That we're not trying to escape it. The other thing, and I think I didn't mention this when I talked about it, but I think it's important. There is a lot of language in Genesis 1 that is, and this is one of those times where I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg situation, but there are a lot of people who read Genesis 1 as depictions of construction of temple, that there's a lot of temple language. And one of the reasons they say that is because when the tabernacle is created, there are a ton of connections between tabernacle and creation. And the Spirit moving on the people who did it, it being finished on started on the new year. I mean, there's just all these connections. And so the last thing you do after creating a temple, if you build a temple, the very last thing you do is you put an idol in the temple, an idol of the god. And so that connection is that the message then is this is a place where heaven, God's heavens, touches earth, a place where fellowship can happen, where God can hang out with humanity, that we are the only legitimate idols in the world, right? You're not supposed to make anything with human hands, but human beings are okay. Human beings are legitimate idols that speak for the divine into this world. And so these are 4 things, but they come with a lot of weight, right, behind them, that sense of,
Like bottom line stuff.
yeah, for me, this is significant. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the notion of temple, by the way, if Genesis 1 is creation of temple, and I think it probably is, then Genesis chapter 1 begins the story as universe as temple. Revelation 21, spoiler alert, Revelation 21, it'd be a while before we get there, so I go ahead and spoil it now. You'll forget by then. The holy city of Jerusalem. You remember the shape of the holy city? You ever read Revelation enough to know what it's shaped like? It's a cube. It's a big cube. It's 12,000 stadia one way and by 12,000 by 12,000 all the way. So it's this huge, big square. You know what else is square in the Bible, or is cube in the Bible? The Holy of Holies. The point in Revelation is there is no temple in the new city because all of creation is the temple and humanity is living in the Holy of Holies with God, finally, ultimately. We finally get this desire from Genesis 1 fully realized at the end of the story where God is finally dwelling with God's people, ultimately, which I just think so the Bible both begins and ends with a temple image, and that's kind of a cool thing. So, anything else? Any other questions? Thoughts? Comments? Diatribe? Violent
I don't mean
opposition?
to beat the dead horse, but when you say 6th century BC was the latest for Genesis,
Right.
is that right time of the exile? Right
That's
after?
during the exile.
During-
Yeah,
during-
yeah. It always takes a moment of crisis for anyone to start writing stuff down or saving it, right? I mean, prior to the exile, the Bible tells us you could lose the book of the Torah and no one would notice. I mean, they were cleaning out the temple with King Josiah in the 7th century, and they found the book of Deuteronomy. And it's like, we got this bill, we got to pay, we got this. Oh, and we found this scroll, and they read it for him, and he panics. But the text wasn't that important. You could lose it. And of course, I don't guess we're that different, right? How long before we realized our Bible was missing? Probably when we had a moment of crisis and we're going to find it. That favorite Bible. So that kind of exile is when everything starts to be put together. I have no doubt, I really don't have any doubt that there were probably written fragments of the text before this. That there were probably the Genesis 2 and 3 stories, the Genesis 1 story, probably preserved in some way, but it was after exile. So you know what, we got to get these things together. We've got to put this. some manner of, well, even in the first century, it was that first generation dying off that said, we've got to put these stories of Jesus together in the story. We can't just, so it was about a generation after Jesus that we get the New Testament. It was that crisis that motivated it there. So, yeah.
Are there internal clues that would help you figure out what crisis precipitated it?
The Genesis, yeah, exile. It was the exile, suddenly finding yourself in Babylon. And so you tell this creation story that happens to invoke these Babylonian creation images and speaks against them pretty loudly. So I think it's probably the Babylonian exile that does. Yeah. And let me just say, that's my default answer on anything. So what do you think preempted this being written down? Oh, probably exile. It's probably exile. Yeah, I mean, exile, it's hard to overestimate that. Why do you save the Exodus stories? Why are those important? Because you're in the middle of exile, right? And you want to remember that story being led out of captivity. So let's make sure and tell that one. So yeah, exile is formative, dark night of the soul for Israel. Yeah.
If you were teaching an Old Testament class,
Yeah.
would you go into more detail than you've done here, or would you have time to?
I would probably not go into a lot more detail than I've done this tonight. If I'm in a Genesis class, if I'm doing the whole semester on Genesis, then yeah, I would spend probably 2 weeks on
Do
Genesis.
you in fact do that?
What's I have?
Okay.
I have, because then I've got 6 hours to talk about Genesis 1 as opposed to 1 hour to talk about Genesis 1. So I just talk faster for you guys. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to hang around and talk, we can do that. I know some of you have to get to choir practice, and I do not want to take Ray's time away at all. But thank you for coming and making us get more chairs. So hopefully we'll have fun next week, and I'll make sure and cut the Wi-Fi off next week. So hopefully that worked too.
It did. And we say hi to Guy and Brad who are watching.
Hi, Guy and Brad.